Ce jour-là, j'ai eu l'impression de perdre toute ma famille proche avec laquelle j'avais vécu des années. J'avais l'impression de ne plus avoir de mère. Je ne suis pas triste qu'elle soit en prison après ce qu'elle a fait. Mais j'aimerais retrouver ma mère. Et c'est ce que je cherche chaque fois que je lui parle. Bonjour maman.
Tu m'entends?
Oui. Juste une question. Est-ce qu'elle tentait de t'échapper? C'est pour ça qu'elle était sur la terrasse?
Peut-être. Oui.
Elles ont souffert, d'après toi?
Je suis vraiment désolée, ma puce.
Elle a ôté deux vies qu'elle ne pourra jamais ramener. Et ça, personne ne pourra l'oublier ou le lui pardonner. Je n'avais jamais vu cette photo. Je n'avais jamais vu à quoi elle ressemblait ce jour-là. Elle a l'air vide. C'est le visage de ma mère, mais son âme n'est plus là. J'ai vécu à Hot Springs, dans l'Arkansas, une grande partie de ma vie. Ma petite enfance a été heureuse. Ma mère et moi étions très proches. Mon père n'était pas souvent là. Il est chauffeur poids lourd, alors il revenait peut-être une fois toutes les 2 semaines. Mais je n'ai jamais eu l'impression qu'il y avait des problèmes. Quand on était tous les trois, on était une famille très heureuse, sans soucis apparents en général. Mais même si je ne le voyais pas, il y avait quand même des problèmes, c'est sûr. Un soir, je m'occupais de mon côté comme une enfant normale. Et tout à coup, ma mère s'est mise à crier sur mon père.
Comment tu as osé?
Quand ça a commencé, j'étais dans la pièce d'à côté. Alors j'ai passé la tête. J'ignorais ce qu'il se passait et pourquoi.
Après tout ce que j'ai fait!
Elle le surplombait et lui était assis sur une chaise. Il ne disait rien. Il n'a pas essayé de se défendre ou de répliquer.
Tu vas rester assis là?
Elle a alors jeté son alliance à travers la pièce. Ça m'a fait un peu peur. Quand j'ai vu le visage de ma mère à ce moment-là, ce n'était plus du tout le même. Je n'avais jamais vu cette expression. J'étais très troublée et en colère contre elle parce que je ne l'avais jamais vue comme ça, être méchante avec mon père pour quoi que ce soit. Je ne comprenais pas.
Lève-toi! Lève-toi et va-t'en! Dégage!
Plus tard, ma mère m'a dit qu'elle avait découvert la liaison de mon père avec une autre femme qui attendait en plus un enfant de lui. J'étais sous le choc. Elle en voulait à cette femme. Et elle commençait à ruminer sur le fait qu'elle et mon père étaient faits l'un pour l'autre et que rien au monde ne pourrait les séparer. C'est là que ma mère a commencé à être obsédée par la liaison de mon père avec l'autre femme. Et ça n'a fait qu'empirer à partir de là. C'est moi et ma petite sœur Megan, au lendemain de sa naissance. Ça devait être la toute première fois que je la tenais dans mes bras. J'étais extatique. J'ai vu mon père marcher dans le couloir avec ma petite sœur dans les bras et un immense sourire sur le visage. C'était une très belle journée. J'avais environ 9 ans et demi sur cette photo. J'avais toujours rêvé d'avoir un frère ou une sœur. Et j'étais prête pour l'avenir. C'est ce que j'ai eu en tête toute la journée, ce jour-là. J'essaye vraiment de m'accrocher aux bons souvenirs parce qu'une grande partie de sa vie n'a pas été joyeuse du tout. Et je ne pouvais rien faire pour changer ça. Pardon. Je ne pouvais pas la sortir de cette situation parce que j'étais moi-même une enfant. Alors je ne savais pas quoi faire. Et je n'ai vraiment compris à quel point c'était toxique dans ce foyer que quand il était trop tard. Après la naissance de ma sœur, ma mère m'a révélé qu'elle avait décidé de faire ce bébé pour garder mon père. Parce qu'elle avait l'impression qu'il allait mettre un terme à leur mariage, quitter la maison et nous abandonner, ma mère et moi. Elle avait donc cherché un moyen de le retenir. C'était assez clair pour moi que ma mère nourrissait une forte jalousie envers la femme avec laquelle mon père avait une liaison. Parce que chaque fois qu'il partait sur la route, elle avait peur qu'il aille la voir au lieu de travailler. Et parfois, c'était le cas. Elle en discutait avec moi beaucoup. Assez souvent, pour tout dire. Presque tous les jours, elle parlait de mon père et exprimait l'espoir qu'il ne la quitte pas. Un an après la naissance de ma sœur, je m'occupais dans ma chambre, comme d'habitude. Soudain, elle déboule en larmes et s'assoit sur mon lit avec moi. Elle m'explique que mon père a plus ou moins officialisé la chose, genre « Je m'en vais, je ne t'aime plus ». Il ne l'aimait plus vraiment depuis ma naissance, mais il était resté pour moi. Pour ma mère, c'était l'autre femme qui avait ruiné son mariage.
C'est un monstre!
Cette autre femme voulait éloigner mon père de sa famille pour le garder auprès d'elle. Sur le coup, je voulais la consoler. « Maman ?» Je ne savais pas comment faire, j'étais toute jeune. Je savais qu'elle était bouleversée et que ce n'était pas juste de sa faute. Mais l'expression sur son visage s'est transformée.
Elle va comprendre ce que ça fait.
Elle s'est mise à parler de l'autre femme.
Je vais la remettre à sa place.
Et de ce qu'elle allait faire pour se venger d'elle et lui faire du mal. Elle m'a dit qu'elle avait eu l'idée de jeter une grosse boîte de clous dans son allée. La colère et la violence de ma mère s'intensifiaient.
Faut bien que quelqu'un le fasse.
Les paroles de ma mère me faisaient très peur parce que malgré ce qui s'était passé avec mes parents et cette histoire d'adultère, j'avais toujours considéré ma mère comme une personne aimante et attentionnée. incapable de faire du mal à autrui en aucune manière. Alors l'entendre préparer sa vengeance, est-ce que c'est vraiment elle? Elle venait me voir presque tous les jours pour se plaindre. Elle tournait en boucle sur l'idée de lui faire du mal. Et ça me faisait très peur, pour être honnête. Je me demandais ce qui allait se passer. Cette photo montre ma grand-mère et ma petite sœur, Megan. À ce moment-là, ma sœur devait avoir 3 mois. Et c'était la première fois que ma grand-mère la voyait. Elle aimait sa nouvelle petite fille. Et elle voulait garder un bon souvenir des moments passés avec ce bébé. Après le divorce de mes parents, on a dû s'installer chez ma grand-mère parce qu'on n'avait pas les moyens de vivre seul. Et l'adaptation a été très difficile au début. En plus, ma grand-mère avait des problèmes de santé qui la faisaient souffrir. Elle n'était plus toute jeune. Elle avait plus de 70 ans. On s'aimait, elle et moi. Et je sais que ma grand-mère aurait fait tout son possible pour me protéger. Mais on ne pouvait pas se permettre d'aller vivre ailleurs que chez elle. La frustration s'est donc accumulée chez ma mère, provoquant de nombreuses disputes entre elle et ma grand-mère. Ma sœur n'a pas eu une enfance formidable à cause de ma mère qui cédait à sa colère, qui la punissait, lui donnait des fessées, lui criait dessus. C'était quotidien.
On peut aller jouer?
Je suis occupée.
Ma mère refusait d'aller la regarder jouer dehors. Elle remettait toujours à plus tard, genre « Va t'asseoir, prends des jouets, regarde la télé, mais ne me dérange pas et ne m'énerve pas. » Ma mère donnait toujours l'impression d'être à cran. Et tout ce que faisait Megan l'agaçait. Elle lui criait tout le temps dessus.
Qu'est-ce que j'ai dit à propos des jouets sur la table?
On marchait toujours sur des œufs parce que ma mère était en permanence énervée et en colère.
Arrête de faire du bruit!
Quand elle s'en prenait à nous, elle ne plaisantait pas. Et je détestais voir ma sœur subir tout ça. Je faisais très attention de ne pas dire à ma mère quelque chose qui pourrait la contrarier. Surtout pour éviter qu'elle se déchaîne sur moi.
Et toi?
J'avais peur de ma mère. À tel point que je n'étais plus du tout à l'aise dans la maison parce que je ne savais pas comment ma mère allait réagir. J'aimais bien voir mon père parce que c'était différent. Ça me permettait d'échapper un peu au quotidien de la maison. Il nous sortait et on faisait des choses, comme manger au restaurant, faire du karting, etc. Mais je redoutais le retour à la maison. Parce que pendant toute la soirée, ma mère me posait des questions sur lui.
C'était comment?
Vous avez fait quoi? Est-ce qu'il a parlé de moi? Qu'est-ce qu'il a dit?
De quoi vous avez parlé?
De rien. C'était une journée entre un père et ses filles. Alors on ne parlait pas d'elle. Et ça la rendait vraiment enragée, je dirais. Elle tournait en boucle.
Bonne nuit.
Elle voulait tout savoir, ce qu'on faisait, ce qu'on disait, alors que ça ne la concernait pas. Quand je voyais mon père, il demandait juste comment allait ma mère. Et je répondais, ça va, la routine, elle va au travail et rentre à la maison. Mais il ne disait jamais de mal d'elle. Il était là pour passer du temps avec moi, pas pour parler d'elle. Je pense qu'elle avait peur qu'il parle d'elle. Mais en même temps, c'est ce qu'elle espérait. Ça aurait voulu dire qu'il pensait à elle. Je pense que chaque journée passée avec mon père l'a rendue de plus en plus paranoïaque. Elle pensait toujours qu'il se passait des choses entre mon père et moi que je ne lui racontais pas. Alors, qu'on ne parlait pas d'elle. J'essayais juste de passer un bon moment avec mon père. Et le temps passant, elle était toujours remontée contre mon père et ma belle-mère pour ce qui s'était passé. Et elle n'arrivait pas à accepter que mon père ne reviendrait jamais auprès d'elle. Elle a sombré de plus en plus dans la dépression. On avait décidé de fêter l'anniversaire de Megan dans un petit parc en ville. Mon père était invité, mais je ne pensais pas qu'il viendrait avec ma belle-mère. Tout l'après-midi, mon père n'a parlé qu'à ma belle-mère, ce qui a beaucoup énervé ma mère. Ma mère était très tendue et contrariée par ce scénario et par son sentiment d'impuissance. Mais c'était très malsain de voir à quel point elle essayait de s'accrocher à lui. Et elle n'aurait pas dû faire ça. Vers la fin, alors qu'on rangeait tout, ma belle-mère a dû dire quelque chose à voix basse. Je ne sais pas exactement quoi, mais ça concernait ma mère. Elle est toujours comme ça? Et ça a rendu ma mère furieuse. Elle a ouvert le coffre de notre voiture et elle en a sorti un gros bout de bois dont je ne connaissais même pas l'existence. Elle l'a pris dans ses mains.
T'as quelque chose à dire?
Prête à la frapper avec. J'ai eu très peur. On a tous eu très peur.
Je t'écoute.
Je ne savais pas quoi faire pour la calmer. Je l'ai supplié, s'il te plaît, maman, ne fais pas ça. Et en voyant ça, mon père l'a menacé de la dénoncer aux services sociaux. Alors ma mère est revenue à grands pas vers la voiture. Elle tenait toujours le gros bout de bois qu'elle a violemment jeté dans le coffre, manquant de peu la tête de ma sœur. J'ai eu très très peur et je ne savais pas quoi faire.
Grimpe.
J'étais bouleversée et effrayée par cet incident et je n'avais aucune idée de ce qui allait se passer ensuite. Je crois qu'on n'en a plus jamais parlé après ce jour-là. Cet épisode a été mis de côté. C'était la première fois que je voyais ma mère agir aussi violemment. Mais ça n'allait pas être la dernière. Ma mère a fini par sortir avec d'autres hommes. Elle s'est inscrite sur des sites spécialisés et a rencontré d'autres hommes. J'étais heureuse qu'elle tente de se concentrer sur autre chose que mon père et qu'elle ne passe pas son temps à la maison. Ma mère trouvait que l'état de santé et les douleurs de ma grand-mère s'aggravaient. Alors, je me suis retrouvée à m'occuper d'elle tous les soirs, chaque week-end. T'es jolie? Depuis quelque temps, j'avais un petit copain que je n'avais pas vu en dehors du lycée depuis plusieurs semaines. Alors j'ai dit, ça fait un bail qu'on ne s'est pas vu en dehors de l'école. Est-ce qu'on peut sortir? Et ma mère n'a pas hésité une seconde. Elle a dit, non, c'est moi qui vais sortir avec mon mec. Chaque fois que je tentais d'exprimer ce que je voulais ou ressentais, elle me répondait que je devais faire ce qu'on me disait.
Fin de la discussion.
Elle m'a dit de prendre mes responsabilités, mais Megan était ma sœur, pas ma fille. C'était la sienne, et c'était donc sa responsabilité à elle. Ma mère faisait passer ses besoins et envies avant les miens. Puis elle a commencé à s'absenter, plus seulement les soirs, mais pendant quelques jours. Et moi, je devais rester à la maison avec ma sœur. Je ne pouvais ni sortir ni faire quoi que ce soit. Je voulais que ma mère soit heureuse, mais elle partait tellement souvent que j'avais l'impression d'être la maîtresse de maison. Avec le temps, c'est devenu de plus en plus tendu entre nous. Au bout d'un moment, ma grand-mère et moi étions d'accord sur le fait qu'il devait sortir de nos vies.
Qu'est-ce qu'il y a?
C'était très dur pour moi parce que je savais qu'elle allait balayer mes arguments. Il ne t'apporte rien de bon.
Tu ne sais rien de ce qui est bon pour moi.
Je lui ai fait comprendre que je ne pensais pas qu'il était bien pour cette famille.
Sale gosse.
Ça ne lui a pas plu et elle est devenue furieuse contre moi. Elle a commencé à me hurler dessus, ce qui m'a fait très peur. J'essayais de me défendre, mais je me suis mise à pleurer. Je n'ai pas réussi à retenir mes émotions. Pourquoi tu fais ça? C'est monté très vite.
La ferme.
Puis elle a poussé ma chaise. J'ai basculé et ma tête a failli percuter le réfrigérateur. J'étais sous le choc, complètement sans voix. J'étais bouleversée par son geste. Je n'arrêtais pas de me dire, comment ma mère peut-elle faire ça? Elle ne s'est pas excusée. Et j'ai alors renoncé à avoir de bonnes relations avec ma mère. À ce stade, je n'avais plus aucune confiance en elle. Je ne savais pas quoi faire ni quoi lui dire pour qu'elle essaye de changer. Ce jour-là, dans la cuisine, c'était la première fois qu'elle se montrait violente envers moi. Et j'avais une peur bleue que ça se reproduise un jour ou l'autre. Après ça, je ne me sentais plus en sécurité chez moi. Pendant la période où elle était absente, c'était très calme dans la maison. Il n'y avait que moi et ma grand-mère. J'allais au lycée tous les jours, puis je rentrais. Ma sœur me manquait, bien sûr, mais dans l'ensemble, c'était très chouette. Je suis restée avec ma grand-mère pendant 2 semaines. Quand ma mère est revenue, j'étais un peu déçue. Je pensais qu'elle venait chercher des affaires et qu'elle repartirait chez son compagnon. C'est en tout cas ce qu'elle avait dit au début.
On va rester finalement.
Mais elle a fini par admettre qu'elle revenait vivre avec nous parce que son compagnon l'avait mise à la porte. Ma mère m'a demandé si elle pouvait dormir sur mon lit. Mais comme elle était toute sale et en sueur et qu'elle ne voulait pas prendre une douche, je lui ai demandé de prendre une douche ou peut-être de changer mes draps après. Et ça l'a immédiatement rendue folle de rage.
Comment tu oses me parler comme ça? Tu ne veux pas aider ta propre mère. Hé! Regarde-moi quand je te parle.
En gros, c'était « Pourquoi t'as dit ça? Pourquoi tu me traites comme ça? Va donc vivre avec ton père. » Et franchement, ça faisait mes affaires. Je rêvais de partir, alors j'ai commencé à préparer ma valise. C'est une des rares fois où je me suis opposée à elle.
Hé!
Et elle n'a pas aimé ça.
Écoute-moi, c'est à toi que je parle.
Elle était tellement en colère qu'elle a attrapé une bouteille de bière vide qui se trouvait sur la table. Elle l'a soulevée au-dessus de ma tête en menaçant de me frapper avec.
Vas-y!
À ce moment-là, j'ai eu tellement peur qu'elle me fasse quelque chose. Je ne savais pas quoi faire, mais je voulais pas rester pour le savoir.
C'est ça! Cours! Sors d'ici! Sans un mot!
Je savais que cette maison était un lieu très toxique dont je devais sortir. J'avais 18 ans et aucune obligation de continuer à vivre avec elle. J'ai donc saisi cette opportunité de partir sans aucun regret. Le moment idéal, c'était quand ma mère allait chercher ma sœur à la descente du bus. Ça me laissait un quart d'heure pour rentrer, prendre mes affaires et partir. C'est ce que j'ai fait.
Christine!
Quand j'étais à l'intérieur, j'ai vu que ma sœur avait devancé ma mère pour rentrer à la maison. Alors, j'ai pu lui dire « Salut, je t'aime, tu me manques. Et je suis désolée que ça se soit passé comme ça. Bon, on se voit plus tard. » Et c'est tout. Je repense souvent à ce moment. C'est la dernière fois que j'ai pu lui dire que je l'aimais et la prendre dans mes bras. C'était dur de laisser ma sœur là-bas. Je savais que ma mère ne la traitait pas bien non plus. Avec le recul, ça m'attriste énormément que ce soit la dernière fois. Je sais que j'aurais pu revenir et j'ai l'impression que j'aurais pu en faire plus. Mais en même temps, je ne savais pas comment faire. Je ne savais pas comment contourner ma mère et venir en aide à ma sœur.
Je tiens à dire ceci. Dieu n'aime pas les mariages qui s'arrêtent. Quand on se marie, c'est pour la vie. D'accord? Ton père et moi sommes séparés depuis 7 ans. Parce que une femme s'est mise entre nous. D'accord? Elle est le diable.
C'est l'attitude d'une personne qui ne m'est pas familière. Je me suis dit que je devrais peut-être enregistrer ça au cas où il arriverait quelque chose et qu'on ait besoin d'une explication ou d'éléments pour comprendre ce qui avait mené à ce qui se passerait, même si j'ignorais que ça se produirait le lendemain. J'ai pas bien compris ce qu'il disait parce que il était dans tous ses états. Il a dit, tu dois aller chez ta grand-mère tout de suite. Il s'est passé quelque chose. J'ai dit, mais quoi donc? Que se passe-t-il? Il y a une urgence. Il était en larmes. Je ne comprenais pas ce qui se passait jusqu'à ce qu'il lâche. Ta mère a tué ta sœur et ta grand-mère. À ce moment-là, j'ai perdu toute sensation. Dans un premier temps, je n'y ai pas cru. Je me suis dit, est-ce que je rêve? J'ai l'impression de fondre. Je ne ressens plus rien. Je ne pense plus qu'à ça. Je crie et je pleure parce que je ne comprends pas comment tout ça a pu arriver. J'appelle alors mon père pour lui dire ce qui s'est passé, que ma mère a tué ma sœur et ma grand-mère. Et je n'avais jamais entendu mon père pleurer avant ce jour-là. Et je déteste avoir dû le lui annoncer.
On fait d'abord le tour de la maison. Donc nous deux, on couvre la maison et deux autres y vont avec le chien.
Ouais, vu qu'on sait pas où elle est, cette bonne femme.
Peut-être qu'elle est à l'arrière.
On arrive.
Bien reçu. Ok, je passe devant. Attention. Je lui passe les menottes. Vous avez quelque chose sur vous?
Oui, je n'avais jamais vu ces images.
Bon, levez-vous.
On voit qu'il y a du sang partout sur elle. C'est... Oui. Je ne pensais pas voir ça. Après avoir commis son acte, elle est allée au sous-sol pour essayer d'incendier la maison. Apparemment, elle avait toute sa tête. Elle semblait suivre un plan et cherchait certainement à effacer ses traces.
J'ai jamais été menottée de ma vie.
Va falloir vous y faire.
Lors de ma discussion avec ma mère la veille au soir, elle m'avait dit qu'il y avait une urgence et que je devais revenir tout de suite. J'ai répondu « Désolée, mais je ne reviendrai pas à la maison à moins qu'il y ait quelqu'un de blessé ou de mourant. »
Écoute-moi, Christine. Obéis-moi et rentre à la maison. Je peux pas rentrer maintenant, maman.
Elle voulait à tout prix que je revienne à la maison sans vraiment m'expliquer pourquoi.
Je suis sérieuse, Christine. Écoute-moi bien. Ce que tu dis n'a aucun sens. Bien sûr que si.
Je lui ai répété plusieurs fois « Non, je ne veux plus vivre sous ce toit toxique. C'était pas sain. Et je ne voulais plus vivre comme ça. » Et elle a eu l'air scandalisée par le fait que je ne lui obéisse pas.
Tu dis n'importe quoi. Pour toi, c'est n'importe quoi. Pas pour moi.
En parlant de ma mère avec mon père, il m'a dit qu'elle l'avait appelé avant moi. Elle lui avait demandé s'il pouvait venir l'aider à récupérer le sapin de Noël et à l'installer. C'était un mensonge. On l'a su après les événements parce que le sapin était déjà dans la maison. Elle a donc essayé de nous faire venir tous les deux. Je n'aurais jamais cru qu'elle puisse commettre un acte pareil. C'est une photo des funérailles. J'avais imprimé 2 photos. Ma préférée que j'avais prise de ma sœur et la seule photo correcte que j'ai pu trouver de ma grand-mère. Ce jour-là a été très éprouvant pour moi parce que j'étais là pour leur dire adieu. Tout le monde était là pour ça, mais je n'avais pas eu la chance de pouvoir leur dire adieu. Il y avait beaucoup de gens que je ne connaissais pas, alors j'étais très mal à l'aise. Heureusement, j'avais ma famille près de moi. Ça m'a aidé à gérer un peu mieux ce moment. Ça a été vraiment très dur. Tu as cherché à lui enlever sa souffrance? C'est ça?
Peut-être, je sais pas. Ça me faisait mal parce que je sais qu'elle souffrait. Tu sais, je détestais la voir souffrir.
Mais Megan ne souffrait pas.
Non, Megan ne souffrait pas. Mais j'étais fâchée contre elle parce que...
Est-ce que tu avais planifié tout ça?
Je sais pas. C'est venu comme ça, Christine.
Pourquoi tu voulais que je vienne la veille?
Je sais pas, j'étais en colère.
Pourquoi tu voulais que papa vienne?
J'espérais me remettre avec lui, je sais pas. Je l'aime toujours. Pour moi, elle s'est servie de lui. Elle ne l'aime pas. Tu sais? Elle a ruiné ma vie, Christine. Elle m'a pris tout ce qui comptait pour moi.
Je sais que ma mère a toujours détesté ma belle-mère depuis le jour où elle a découvert leur liaison. Ça ne rimait à rien de revenir là-dessus. Alors que tout ce que je voulais, c'était faire le deuil de ma sœur et de ma grand-mère. Et je parlais à la personne qui me les avait enlevés. Ça prouve bien qu'elle ne s'est jamais vraiment souciée d'autre chose que d'elle-même. C'est dur de savoir que ma sœur tentait de fuir, qu'elle a compris ce qui se passait et qu'elle n'a pas pu s'échapper. Je crois que ma grand-mère dormait dans son lit quand c'est arrivé. Alors j'espère que ça a été rapide et qu'elle n'a pas souffert. Mais ma sœur, je pense qu'elle a beaucoup souffert dans les derniers instants de sa vie. Et je déteste ça. J'aimerais parfois que ma mère ressente ce qu'elle leur a fait endurer, pour qu'elle se rende vraiment compte de la douleur qu'elle a causée. Parce que c'est pas juste. Elle n'avait rien fait de mal. Je veux que ma mère m'entende dire qu'elle a détruit ma vie, qu'elle l'a mise sans dessus-dessous, et que jamais je ne lui pardonnerai, même si elle me suppliait. C'est une photo de moi avec ma petite sœur. Ça devait être le premier jour de maternelle pour ma sœur. Et pour moi, le premier jour du lycée. On était donc toutes les deux super contentes à l'idée de se retrouver dans le bus pour aller à l'école et de partager cette expérience ensemble. Oui, on était très heureuses. C'est un moment qui nous a rapprochés. Mais elle n'a pas eu la chance de grandir beaucoup, alors que moi, oui. Et c'est un constat qui me rend très triste. C'est difficile de se remémorer ces instants maintenant qu'elle est partie. Mais en même temps, on était heureuses à ce moment-là. Et j'aurais voulu que ça dure. J'ai l'impression qu'on a raté plein de choses. Si je pouvais revenir en arrière et lui parler une dernière fois, je lui dirais que je l'aime des dizaines de fois avant de ne plus pouvoir le faire. Elle était pleine de vie et on la lui a enlevée. Pendant la période qui a suivi et jusqu'à maintenant, j'ai beaucoup appris de cette expérience. Et je sais maintenant à quoi je veux que le reste de ma vie ressemble. Je sais quel genre de mère je ne veux pas devenir. Je sais comment je ne traiterai pas mes enfants ou les membres de ma famille en général. Je vais tout faire pour avoir une meilleure vie que celle que ma mère m'a donnée. Et ça m'a aidé à traverser cette épreuve de me concentrer sur les choses positives qui ressortent de ça. J'espère que les gens qui vont regarder cette interview essaieront de faire un peu plus attention à leurs proches et de s'assurer qu'ils vont bien. Parce qu'on ne sait jamais de quoi demain est fait. Et on peut perdre quelqu'un qu'on aime en un instant. Il y a des jours où j'ai un peu plus de chagrin que d'autres. Et je ne peux pas le prédire. Ça arrive quand ça arrive. Mais je sais que je vais m'en sortir et que je vais avoir une bonne vie, malgré ce qui m'est arrivé. Je vais tout faire pour.
They found the front door half open at dawn, the Florida heat already pressing down on the quiet street like a hand over a mouth, and inside the house the air was wrong, heavy still, carrying the sour hint of something that should not have been there, a silence that felt staged, deliberate, as if the house itself were holding its breath, and in that moment, before the tape went up, before the radios crackled, before the word homicide was ever spoken out loud, the case was already slipping into legend, already becoming the kind of story people would whisper about years later and swear they remember differently, because this was Florida in 1995, a place of bright lawns and drawn curtains, of neighbors who waved every morning and locked their doors every night, and what lay beyond that half-open door would fracture that sense of safety in a way the community would never fully repair. The woman inside was known to everyone on the block, the kind of neighbor whose name you didn't need to remember because her face did the work for you, always out early, always polite, always predictable, a life built on routines that made her absence instantly noticeable, and when she didn't show up where she was supposed to, when her car sat unmoved and her phone rang unanswered, concern turned to dread with startling speed. Because routines are comforting until the day they break, and when they do, they announce disaster without saying a word. The living room told a story in fragments, a chair slightly out of place, a glass left unfinished, nothing overtly smashed, nothing screaming violence, just enough disarray to suggest interruption, to suggest that whatever happened here was sudden, unexpected, and close, terrifyingly close. Police moved carefully, their footsteps muted against the tile, eyes scanning for the obvious signs that never came, because this was not the kind of scene that handed over its secrets easily. There was no forced entry.
No shattered window. No sign of a stranger crashing in from the outside.
The door, they noted, could have been left open by someone who belonged there, someone who had no reason to break in, and that single detail would haunt the investigation from its first hour, because it narrowed the field in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. In a neighborhood like this, with its trimmed hedges and friendly nods, narrowing the field meant looking inward, and nobody likes to imagine the danger lives next door. By midday, word spread fast, faster than any official statement, faster than the yellow tape could contain it, and the street filled with hushed conversations and wide eyes, neighbors clustering in small groups, replaying the last time they'd seen her, the last wave, the last smile, each memory now burdened with a weight it never carried before. Some remembered seeing lights on late. Others recalled a voice, maybe raised, maybe not, a sound they hadn't questioned at the time because this was a safe street, because nothing bad ever happened here, because it's always easier to explain away unease than to confront it head-on. In hindsight, every detail felt like a warning sign missed, a clue hiding in plain sight. Detectives arrived with that particular gravity that shifts the tone of any room they enter, their questions calm, methodical, relentless, building a timeline out of scraps and impressions, asking who had been around, who had reason to stop by, who knew her habits well enough to know when she'd be alone. The answers pointed everywhere and nowhere at once. Friends.
Acquaintances. Service workers.
Neighbors. Too many possibilities, all of them ordinary, all of them unsettling. This was not a crime of chaos. This was controlled. Quiet. Intimate. And that made it worse, because it suggested intent, planning, a familiarity with the space and the person who lived in it. The medical examiner's preliminary findings offered no comfort, only more questions, the kind that pile up without offering direction, confirming that she had died hours before discovery, narrowing the window just enough to make everyone on the block feel exposed, because during those hours, life had gone on as usual. People had slept, watched television, stepped outside for a smoke. Someone, somewhere nearby, had been awake while this happened, and that realization settled over the neighborhood like a fog that refused to lift. Florida sun or not, the chill was real. As investigators canvassed door to door, notebooks filling with observations that seemed insignificant on their own, a pattern began to form, not of evidence but of proximity. Several neighbors reported seeing nothing unusual, which in itself felt unusual, because something had happened here, something irreversible, and yet it had passed almost invisibly through a community built on observation and routine. Others mentioned a familiar figure, someone who moved easily between houses, someone whose presence never raised alarms because it had never needed to.
À l'intime neighbor.
Friendly. Helpful.
Always around.
The kind of person who blended into the background by design, by habit, by years of being exactly who everyone expected him to be. At first, his name was just another line in a notebook, another person to check off the list, because in the early days of an investigation, no one wants to leap to conclusions, no one wants to turn suspicion into accusation without something solid to stand on. He spoke calmly. Cooperated fully. His timeline seemed ordinary, unremarkable, almost too clean, but clean timelines are common in quiet neighborhoods, and detectives, trained to distrust coincidences but also trained to avoid tunnel vision, moved on, chasing other leads that felt louder, messier, more obviously dangerous. Days turned into weeks, and the initial shock calcified into a low-grade fear that settled into daily life. People locked their doors earlier. Parents kept their children closer. Conversations on the street grew shorter, guarded, the unspoken question always hanging in the air. Could it happen again, and if so, would we see it coming? Tips poured in, most of them useless, some of them cruel, each one demanding time and energy that the case was already bleeding away. Without a clear suspect, without a weapon, without a confession, the investigation began to drift, not for lack of effort, but because some crimes are built to resist resolution. Inside the house, forensic teams returned again and again, chasing microscopic truths, fibers, prints, anything that could anchor the case to a person rather than a theory, but the scene refused to give itself up. It was as if the killer had understood the limits of the space, had known exactly what to touch and what to leave alone, a level of awareness that suggested more than chance. This was not a panicked act. This was deliberate. And deliberation implies time, and time implies patience, and patience implies someone who had been watching, waiting, learning. As media attention flickered and flared, headlines grew sharper, more speculative, words like mystery and cold case creeping into the language far too early, as if the story itself were rushing toward a conclusion the investigators were not ready to accept. Each article added pressure, not just on law enforcement, but on the community, which found itself trapped between wanting answers and fearing what those answers might reveal. Because answers, in cases like this, rarely arrive without consequences. The neighbor's name surfaced again, this time not as a lead but as a whisper, the kind that spreads sideways, unrecorded, unconfirmed, carried in lowered voices between people who had known him for years and were suddenly re-examining every interaction, every favor, every moment that had felt normal at the time. Was he too helpful? Too present? Or was this just fear talking, turning familiarity into suspicion because the alternative, that a stranger had slipped in and out unseen, felt even more terrifying? Detectives listened, noted, filed it away, unwilling to act on instinct alone, because instinct can lie, and in 1995, without the tools that would one day redefine cold cases, evidence was everything. Months passed. Then a year. The file thickened even as momentum thinned, the case drifting toward that dangerous category where leads dry up and urgency fades, not because the crime matters less, but because time has a way of dulling even the sharpest edges. The house was cleaned. Sold. Lived in again. Life moved forward, unevenly, awkwardly, but inevitably, and yet the absence remained, a hollow space in the collective memory of the street, a reminder that something unresolved still lingered beneath the surface. Investigators changed assignments. New detectives read old notes, retraced old steps, saw the same gaps their predecessors had seen, felt the same frustration settle in their chests, because the case refused to be pinned down. Every so often, a tip would spark brief hope, a name, a sighting, a rumor, only to collapse under scrutiny, leaving behind nothing but exhaustion and the creeping fear that this story would never end properly, never resolve, never deliver the clarity everyone wanted. And through it all, the neighbor remained, a constant presence in a story defined by absence, aging along with the case, blending back into the rhythms of the street, a reminder that time does not pause for grief or suspicion, that people continue to live their lives even as unanswered questions stack up behind them. No arrest. No trial. No closure. Just a Florida street baking under the sun, carrying a secret it did not yet know it was keeping, waiting for the moment when the past would refuse to stay buried any longer. Years slid by the way they always do in unsolved cases, quietly at first, then all at once, until the crime no longer felt recent but never felt finished either, and the file sat in records rooms with its corners softening, its photographs yellowing slightly, its impact dulled only on the surface, because beneath that official stillness the case continued to pulse. A steady reminder that something violent had happened here and had never been answered for. Detectives who had worked it early carried it with them, mentioning it in passing, bringing it up late at night over stale coffee, because some scenes don't let go once you've walked through them, and this one, with its half-open door and its careful silence, had carved itself into memory. The neighborhood learned to live with the weight of it, adapting in small, almost invisible ways, routines adjusted, trust rationed, the street lights feeling harsher than before, less welcoming, more interrogative, as if every shadow now asked a question it never had to ask before. New families moved in, unaware at first of what had happened, then aware in the vague way people are aware of bad history, something you hear about secondhand, stripped of immediacy, turned into a story that sounds unreal until you stand in the exact spot where it unfolded. The older residents noticed the difference immediately, the way newcomers laughed a little louder, walked a little looser, before the truth settled in and the street absorbed them into its cautious rhythm. Inside law enforcement, the case drifted toward that uncomfortable middle ground, not active, not closed, technically open but practically stalled, revisited only when manpower allowed or when a tip arrived that felt, for a moment, like it might finally be the one. Those tips were unpredictable, arriving in bursts, then drying up completely, anonymous calls claiming insider knowledge, letters hinting at secrets, half-formed confessions that collapsed under questioning, each one demanding attention because ignoring the right lead could mean missing justice forever. Most of them went nowhere. A few raised eyebrows, prompted follow-ups, short-lived spikes of hope that ended the same way they always did, with disappointment and more unanswered questions. The neighbor's name, though never formally elevated to suspect, refused to disappear entirely. It resurfaced in different contexts, at different times, carried forward by subtle inconsistencies that never quite crossed the threshold into evidence. Someone mentioned an argument years earlier, something small, easily dismissed, but now remembered differently. Someone else recalled seeing him near the house at an odd hour, a memory that had seemed meaningless until it wasn't. Each recollection arrived wrapped in doubt, colored by hindsight, by the human tendency to retrofit suspicion onto the familiar once safety has been breached. Detectives catalogued it all, careful not to let speculation harden into bias, but equally careful not to ignore patterns simply because they were uncomfortable. In the late 90s, forensic science was advancing, but slowly, unevenly, and many of the tools that would one day redefine cold cases were still theoretical, still confined to research papers and conference rooms. Evidence collected at the scene had been preserved, labeled, stored away, its potential locked behind limitations no one could yet overcome. The hope always was that time would eventually become an ally rather than an enemy, that new methods would breathe life into old samples, that patience would pay off where urgency had failed. For now, all they could do was wait, watch, and keep the file alive. The victim's absence continued to ripple outward, touching people in ways that never made the news. Birthdays passed without her. Holidays came and went, leaving behind the quiet ache of someone missing from the table. Friends aged, moved away, passed on, taking their memories with them, shrinking the pool of first-hand recollections investigators could draw from. Each year that passed took something with it, a detail, a voice, a possibility, and the clock became a silent antagonist, relentless, indifferent, impossible to stop. Occasionally, a detective would drive through the neighborhood on an unrelated call and feel that familiar pull, the instinct to slow down, to look, to imagine the scene again as it had been that first morning, to ask silently what had been missed. Those moments rarely led to breakthroughs, but they reinforced a truth everyone involved understood: this was not just a file number. This was a life interrupted, a community altered, a question still hanging in the air, unanswered because the answer had never been obvious. As the new millennium approached, the case was formally classified as cold, the term carrying a finality that felt premature to those who had lived with it from the start. Cold did not mean forgotten, not exactly, but it did mean dormant, waiting for something external to reignite interest. That something could be a confession, a mistake, a technological leap, or the slow erosion of a conscience. Investigators knew that time had a way of loosening tongues, of turning secrets into burdens too heavy to carry forever. They also knew that relying on that hope meant accepting a long, uncertain wait. The neighbor continued his life in parallel, aging as the case aged, his presence on the street as unremarkable as ever, which, paradoxically, made him harder to assess. There were no dramatic changes, no sudden moves, no visible cracks, just the steady continuation of routine, a constancy that could be read as innocence or as something more calculated, depending on where suspicion landed. Law enforcement watched from a distance, constrained by the same lack of evidence that had always defined the case, unable to act, unwilling to accuse without cause. Then, years later, a small shift occurred, subtle enough that it barely registered outside investigative circles, a development in forensic analysis that reopened conversations about what might still be possible with the evidence on hand. It wasn't a breakthrough, not yet, but it was enough to prompt a review, a quiet re-examination of materials long thought exhausted. Boxes were pulled from storage. Logs were checked. Samples were reassessed with fresh eyes and updated protocols. The process was methodical, painstaking, the kind of work that rarely makes headlines but lays the groundwork for everything that follows. As technicians revisited the physical remnants of the crime, detectives revisited the human landscape, re-interviewing witnesses where possible, tracking down people who had once been peripheral, hoping that time had shifted perspectives, sharpened memories, or reduced fear. Some conversations yielded nothing new. Others produced details that had never seemed important enough to mention before, small behaviors, fleeting interactions, now recontextualized by decades of distance. Memory is unreliable, but it is also persistent, and sometimes what survives longest are the moments that never quite made sense. The neighbor was interviewed again, years after his first statement, the questions familiar but the context changed, the passage of time adding a different pressure, a different texture to the exchange. He remained calm, consistent, his answers aligned with what he had said before, but investigators noted the strain beneath the surface, the subtle defensiveness, the careful phrasing, details that might have meant nothing or might have meant everything. Without corroboration, without physical proof, those impressions remained just that, impressions, filed away alongside everything else. Outside, the world moved on, crime stories rising and falling in public consciousness, newer tragedies replacing older ones, but for those tied to this case, the sense of unfinished business never faded. It lingered in quiet moments, in empty offices, in the spaces between questions that had no answers yet. This was the nature of cold cases, their cruelty and their power, the way they refused to resolve themselves, the way they waited patiently for the smallest crack to appear. By the time 2 decades had passed, the case had become a benchmark, a reference point, cited in discussions about unsolved crimes, about patience, about the limits of investigation and the promise of perseverance. It was no longer just about what had happened in that house in 1995, but about what could still happen, what might yet be uncovered if the right piece finally fell into place. And somewhere beneath the Florida sun, beneath the routines and the years, the truth remained, intact, unyielding, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer protect it. The crack finally came not with a confession or a dramatic tip, but with paperwork, with forms signed in fluorescent-lit rooms and evidence boxes opened under new protocols, the kind of moment that never makes the evening news but quietly changes everything. Advances in forensic science had been promised for years, spoken about like a distant horizon, and now they were here, practical, precise, capable of pulling meaning from what had once seemed inert. Samples taken from the house, handled carefully back in 1995 and stored with cautious optimism, were suddenly relevant again, their potential no longer theoretical but tangible, measurable, dangerous to anyone who had believed time would erase them. The lab work took months, slow and meticulous, each step documented, verified, repeated, because cold cases demand a level of certainty that fresh investigations can sometimes afford to rush past. Analysts knew the stakes. A mistake here would not just delay justice, it would damage credibility, poison a case that had waited decades for its moment. As results began to emerge, they didn't arrive as answers, but as probabilities, as partial matches, as statistical whispers that suggested direction without declaring truth outright. It was enough to reignite interest, enough to justify resources, enough to reopen doors that had been quietly closed. Detectives reconvened, some veterans returning out of personal investment, others newcomers encountering the case for the first time, bringing fresh skepticism unburdened by years of frustration. The file was spread across tables again, timelines reconstructed, relationships re-examined with a sharper lens, because what had once seemed ordinary could now be re-evaluated in light of new possibilities. Patterns that had felt too thin to pursue before were no longer dismissed so easily. The investigation narrowed, not abruptly, but decisively, guided by data that refused to be ignored. The neighbor's name surfaced again, this time with more gravity, no longer just a whisper or a marginal note, but a point of convergence where proximity, opportunity, and emerging forensic indicators overlapped. It was not enough to accuse, not enough to arrest, but it was enough to focus. Surveillance was discreet, limited by legal boundaries and the passage of time, but attention shifted, subtle questions asked, background details revisited. His life, once a blur of normalcy, was now examined frame by frame, looking for fractures that had gone unnoticed. Interview intensified. People who had long since made peace with not being asked again found detectives on their doorsteps, voices calm but insistent, explaining that new developments required old conversations to be revisited. Some reacted with relief, others with irritation, a few with visible fear, because reopening the past meant reopening emotions that had been carefully buried. Memories surfaced unevenly, some clearer than expected, others distorted by years of retelling, but investigators listened to all of it, aware that truth often hides in repetition, in the overlap between accounts rather than in any single narrative. One detail, small and easily overlooked in 1995, gained new significance. A timing discrepancy. A neighbor's recollection of seeing someone where they shouldn't have been, at an hour that no longer aligned cleanly with the accepted timeline. On its own, it meant nothing. Paired with lab results suggesting contact that had never been explained, it began to matter. The investigation tightened, its focus sharpening, the sense growing that the case was no longer drifting but moving slowly, deliberately, toward something concrete. The longtime neighbor was approached again, this time with a different tone, the casual familiarity of earlier interviews replaced by professional distance. He noticed the change immediately. People always do. Questions were more specific. Clarifications were requested. Old statements were read back to him, discrepancies highlighted, not as accusations, but as invitations to explain. He did carefully, his answers measured, consistent on the surface, but the room felt heavier, charged, the air thick with the unspoken understanding that this was no longer routine. Investigators watched closely, noting the pauses, the deflections, the moments where memory seemed to falter not from age, but from pressure. None of it was enough, not yet, but combined with forensic indicators, it justified further steps. Search warrants were considered, debated, delayed, because the margin for error was thin and the consequences enormous. Decades had passed. Any move made now had to be right. As legal strategies took shape, the community remained largely unaware, the work happening quietly, intentionally shielded from public view to protect its integrity. To the outside world, the case was still cold, still unsolved, a relic of another era. Inside the investigation, momentum was building, cautious but undeniable. Each piece added weight, each confirmation reducing the room for doubt. The forensic results were refined, retested, pushed as far as the science would allow, until probabilities tightened into something closer to certainty. Still, science alone could not tell the whole story. It could suggest presence, contact, proximity, but motive and action required narrative, required context, required human explanation. That meant digging deeper into relationships, into history, into moments that had once seemed inconsequential. Old arguments were re-examined, past tensions reassessed, not dramatized, not exaggerated, but understood in their proper scale. The image of a perfect, uneventful neighborhood continued to erode under scrutiny, replaced by something more realistic, more human, where resentment simmered quietly and boundaries blurred over years of familiarity. Nothing explosive. Nothing obvious. Just enough friction to remind investigators that violence rarely announces itself ahead of time. The neighbor's routine, so stable for so long, was mapped against the day of the crime with new precision. Work records. Receipts. Witness accounts. Gaps emerged, small windows of time previously dismissed as irrelevant, now scrutinized for possibility. Each gap was an opportunity, each unaccounted moment a question mark. None proved guilt on its own. Together, they formed a shape that was increasingly difficult to ignore. Pressure mounted internally. Detectives debated next steps, aware that moving too quickly could collapse the case, but waiting too long could mean losing what little leverage they had. Aging witnesses were not getting younger. Memories were not improving. The clock, once an enemy, was now a motivator, urging action before another year slipped by and took more answers with it. Finally, a decision was made to confront the past directly, to bring the neighbor in for a formal interview under conditions that left no room for ambiguity. This was no longer a casual conversation. This was recorded, structured, deliberate. The questions traced the same path again and again, circling key moments, testing consistency under repetition, watching for cracks that might appear when the pressure held steady. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies every breath, every shift in posture, every flicker of emotion across a face. He denied involvement as he always had, but the certainty that once anchored those denials seemed thinner now, strained by the weight of evidence that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Investigators pressed gently, then more firmly, laying out what they knew without revealing everything, a calculated balance designed to provoke response without tipping their hand. He listened. He answered. He did not confess. And yet, when the interview ended, when he was allowed to leave, something had changed. The distance between suspicion and action had narrowed. What had once been a cold case defined by absence was now a case defined by accumulation, by the slow, relentless gathering of proof that refused to fade with time. The path forward was still uncertain, but it was clearer than it had ever been, and for the first time in decades, the possibility of resolution felt real, not as a promise, but as a looming inevitability, hanging in the air, waiting for the final pieces to fall into place. The shift from investigation to accusation is never announced out loud. It happens in the margins, in the tightening of language, in the way questions stop being open-ended and start pointing somewhere specific, and in this case that shift unfolded quietly, deliberately, as detectives moved from gathering possibilities to testing one increasingly unavoidable conclusion. The neighbor, once a background figure in a quiet street, was now the gravitational center of the case, not because of a single explosive revelation, but because everything else had slowly fallen away, leaving him standing alone in the negative space where answers should have been. Search warrants followed, narrow in scope, precise in wording, crafted to survive scrutiny, because after decades of waiting there would be no second chance if this collapsed. Old storage areas were opened. Boxes untouched for years were pulled into the light. Items that had seemed meaningless when first collected were re-examined with a different purpose, not to find something new, but to confirm what was already suspected. The process was methodical, almost reverent, as if everyone involved understood that this was the closest the case had ever come to speaking for itself. Nothing dramatic surfaced at first.
No hidden weapon. No written confession.
No obvious relic of guilt. Instead, there were alignments, confirmations, quiet validations of theories that had once felt speculative. Fibers matched where they should not have matched. Contact was supported where denial had stood for years. The science did not shout. It nodded. And sometimes a nod is more dangerous than a scream. Investigators built their case the way engineers build a bridge, piece by piece, stress-testing every assumption, anticipating every defense, because they knew exactly what they were up against. Time. Memory. Reasonable doubt amplified by decades. They knew the defense would argue contamination, coincidence, reinterpretation, the fallibility of human recollection stretched across years. So the work doubled back on itself, every conclusion checked and rechecked, every result verified independently, because the only thing worse than no resolution was the wrong one. As pressure mounted behind the scenes, the neighbor's life continued outwardly unchanged, which only sharpened the contrast. He still walked the same routes. Still exchanged the same greetings. Still existed inside the rhythms of the street that had once protected him with its assumptions. But investigators saw the strain now, the subtle changes, the vigilance, the awareness that something was shifting even if no one had said it out loud. People know when the ground beneath them starts to move. Another interview was scheduled, this time unavoidable, framed as procedural, but weighted with intent. He arrived composed, practiced in calm, but the dynamic in the room was different. The detectives were no longer searching for truth in a wide field. They were narrowing in, repeating questions not because they lacked answers, but because they wanted to see how he handled the ones that mattered. Timelines were laid out again, cleaner now, stripped of uncertainty. Gaps were pointed to directly. Explanations were requested, then requested again, phrased slightly differently, watching for drift. He pushed back politely, firmly, insisting on the same story he had told for years, a story that had survived this long precisely because it was simple, because it avoided detail, because it gave nothing away. But simplicity has limits, and under sustained pressure, it begins to look less like clarity and more like evasion. The room filled with that particular tension that arises when everyone present understands that the conversation is no longer casual, no longer exploratory, but no one is ready to say what it has become. Outside the interview room, prosecutors were looped in, cautious but attentive, reviewing summaries, examining evidence, asking the questions investigators had learned to anticipate. Is it enough? Is it clean? Will it hold? Each affirmative answer was provisional, each doubt addressed not with confidence, but with documentation. This was not about speed. This was about endurance, about building something that could stand up in court after decades of waiting. As the case tightened, word began to leak in the quiet ways it always does, not through headlines, but through tone, through the sudden seriousness in conversations that had once felt hypothetical. The community sensed it before it was told.
Something was happening.
The old story was being touched again, stirred after years of stillness. People who had lived with the case for so long felt the shift instinctively, the same way they had felt the original shock all those years ago. The neighbor noticed the looks now, the pauses, the way conversations ended a little sooner when he approached. No accusations were spoken, but suspicion has a gravity of its own, and once it takes hold, it changes the air around a person. He withdrew slightly, or perhaps people pulled away. From the outside, the difference was subtle. From the inside, it was unmistakable. Investigators prepared for the final steps with care that bordered on obsession. They revisited everything again, afraid not of missing something new, but of overlooking something old that could unravel the entire case. Every report was read aloud. Every interview transcript reviewed. Every piece of physical evidence traced from collection to storage to analysis. This was the moment when patience met consequence, when years of restraint would either be justified or exposed as misplaced. The decision to move forward did not come with celebration. There was no sense of triumph, only gravity. Arresting someone for a crime committed decades earlier carries a unique weight, because it means acknowledging that time did not heal this wound, that justice delayed had remained justice denied for too long. It also means accepting that the person being arrested had lived a full life in the meantime, years that now stood in stark contrast to the life that had been cut short. On the morning it happened, there were no sirens on the street, no dramatic sweep of flashing lights, just unmarked vehicles pulling up with quiet precision, doors opening, badges shown. The neighbor answered calmly, as he always had, the routine of the street momentarily colliding with the reality that routine could no longer protect him. He listened as he was told why they were there. He did not resist. He did not speak much at all. News traveled faster than the cars that took him away. Phone lit up. Messages flew. A case that had lived in the past suddenly snapped into the present, its name spoken again with urgency, with disbelief. Long-time residents struggled to reconcile the image they had carried for years with the one now unfolding before them. The neighbor. Arrested. The words felt incompatible, jarring, as if spoken in the wrong order. For investigators, the arrest was not an ending but a threshold. What followed would be scrutiny, challenge, defense strategy, the long process of proving in public what had been assembled in private. They knew the hardest part was still ahead. They also knew that turning back was no longer an option. As the street returned to its uneasy quiet, the weight of history pressed down once more, heavier now, reshaped by the knowledge that the threat had not been external, not a stranger passing through, but something familiar, something that had lived alongside them for years. The Florida sun rose and fell as it always had, indifferent to revelation, but beneath its glare the story had changed irrevocably. The cold case was no longer cold. It was awake. And nothing would be the same again. The arrest did not bring relief the way people imagine it does, not a clean release, not a collective exhale, but a new tension that spread through the community like an aftershock, because when a suspect is taken into custody after decades of silence, the past doesn't settle, it resurfaces, sharper, louder, demanding to be examined again under unforgiving light. The street that had learned to live with unanswered questions now had to confront the possibility that those questions had been standing in plain sight all along, wearing a familiar face, sharing small talk over fences, blending seamlessly into the background of everyday life.
Inside the interrogation room, time compressed.
The neighbor sat across from detectives who had prepared for this moment for years, their tone controlled, their approach deliberate, knowing that pressure applied too quickly could fracture the case they had worked so carefully to build. This was not about intimidation. This was about gravity. About laying out the weight of what had been uncovered and letting it settle. The room was neutral, almost sterile, but the history between them filled every inch of space, decades of denial meeting the present moment head-on. They began with the basics, identity, confirmation, formalities that felt absurd given the magnitude of what hung between them, then moved steadily toward the core, revisiting the day of the crime with a precision that left no room for improvisation. Times. Locations. Movements. The neighbor listened, his expression guarded, eyes occasionally drifting as if searching for an exit that did not exist. When he spoke, his words were careful, clipped, offering as little as possible without refusing outright. He had practiced this restraint for years. It showed. Detectives presented fragments of the case incrementally, never all at once, never revealing the full scope of what they had, watching closely for reactions, for shifts in posture, for the subtle tells that often betray internal conflict. When forensic findings were mentioned, not in detail, just enough to signal their existence, a flicker crossed his face, gone almost immediately, but noted. When timelines were tightened, when gaps were named explicitly, his answers grew shorter, more defensive, the calm beginning to fray at the edges. He denied involvement, repeatedly, emphatically, insisting that he had been misremembered, misunderstood, unfairly targeted because he had been nearby, because proximity had been mistaken for guilt. It was a familiar defense, one investigators had anticipated, because it contained a kernel of truth.
Proximity alone prove nothing.
But this case was no longer about proximity alone. It was about convergence, about multiple lines of evidence intersecting in ways that were increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Outside the room, prosecutors monitored developments closely, advising restraint, urging patience, because an interrogation is not a performance, not a race to a confession, but a process that unfolds over time, sometimes across multiple sessions. They knew that even without a confession, the case could proceed, but they also understood the power of words spoken voluntarily, the way they can anchor evidence in narrative, transform data into accountability. As hours passed, fatigue set in, subtle but undeniable. The neighbor's posture sagged slightly. His voice lost some of its controlled steadiness. Small contradictions began to emerge, not dramatic reversals, but shifts in emphasis, in phrasing, details that no longer aligned perfectly with earlier statements. Investigators circled these gently, returning to them from different angles, watching as the effort required to maintain consistency increased. This was not a collapse. It was erosion. When the interview ended, it ended without resolution, without the cinematic release people expect, because real interrogations rarely provide that kind of closure. He was processed, held, prepared for the next stage. Detectives left the room with the quiet satisfaction of progress, tempered by the understanding that what came next would test every assumption they had made. News of the arrest exploded outward, no longer confined to local whispers, picked up by regional outlets, then national ones, the words cold case and shocking twist appearing side by side in headlines that struggled to convey the full weight of what had happened. Commentators speculated. Armchair analysts dissected timelines. Former neighbors were interviewed, their faces a mix of disbelief and retrospective certainty, memories reshaped by the new narrative taking hold. For the victims' remaining loved ones, the attention was both validating and painful, reopening wounds that had never fully healed, forcing them to relive moments they had spent years trying to move beyond. The arrest did not erase the loss. It reframed it, casting it in sharper relief, reminding them that justice, even delayed, carries its own emotional cost. Closure, they learned, is not a destination. It is a process, uneven and unpredictable. Defense attorneys moved quickly, constructing a strategy that leaned heavily on the passage of time, on the fragility of memory, on the inherent uncertainties of revisiting decades-old evidence. They questioned chain of custody. They challenged forensic interpretations. They argued contamination, coincidence, confirmation bias, every angle designed to widen the gap between suspicion and proof. This was expected. Prepared for. Investigators welcomed the scrutiny, confident in the redundancy they had built into the case. Pre-trial hearings became battlegrounds, each motion a test of the investigation's integrity. Evidence was dissected line by line. Witness credibility weighed against the erosion of years. Experts debated probabilities, margins of error, the limits of science when applied retroactively. It was dense, technical, far removed from the simplicity of the crime itself, but necessary, because justice at this stage demanded precision more than passion. As the legal process advanced, the community grappled with its own reckoning. Conversations shifted from shock to analysis, from disbelief to uneasy acceptance. People replayed interactions in their minds, searching for signs they might have missed, wondering how someone could live among them for so long, carrying what was now alleged to be such a devastating secret. Trust, once fractured again, this time not by the crime itself, but by the realization of how thoroughly it had been hidden. The house where it had all begun resurfaced in public consciousness, its address spoken again, its rooms reimagined through the lens of accusation. New occupants found themselves fielding questions they had never anticipated, living inside a space that history refused to release. Places remember, even when people try to forget, and this house had become a symbol of that stubborn memory. Inside the jail, the neighbor waited, days blending together, the routines of confinement replacing the routines of freedom he had maintained for so long. There were no cameras here, no audience, just the slow grind of anticipation, the knowledge that his life had irrevocably changed, that whatever happened next would define him more than any role he had played before. Silence, once his ally, now worked against him, amplifying every thought. For investigators, there was no victory lap, no sense of completion, only vigilance. They reviewed the case again and again, preparing for trial, anticipating challenges, refining arguments, because the standard they faced was not belief but proof beyond reasonable doubt. They knew that decades of patience could be undone by a single overlooked flaw, and they were determined not to let that happen. As the trial date loomed, the story shifted again, from investigation to judgment, from secrecy to spectacle, the cold case now fully alive, its details scrutinized by strangers far removed from the street where it had begun. Yet beneath the noise, beneath the analysis and debate, the core remained unchanged, a life lost, a question finally addressed, and a community forced to confront the unsettling truth that the most dangerous mysteries are often the ones closest to home. And as Florida heat pressed down on the courthouse steps, mirroring the weight it had applied all those years ago, the sense of inevitability grew stronger. Whatever the outcome, the silence that had protected the past was gone. The story had crossed a line from rumor to reckoning, and there would be no turning back. The trial did not begin with drama, but with procedure, with the measured cadence of a system that moves deliberately even when the emotions surrounding it threaten to surge out of control. And as jurors filed into the courtroom, many of them too young to remember 1995 as anything more than a date in a textbook, the past and present collided in a way that felt almost surreal. This was no longer a story whispered on a quiet street or buried in a filing cabinet. This was public, formal, unavoidable. A cold case, once defined by absence, now demanding judgment in real time. The prosecution opened by laying out the timeline as they saw it, not sensational, not theatrical, but precise, each moment placed carefully, like stones across a river, guiding the jury from routine to rupture without letting them lose their footing. They spoke of familiarity, of trust, of proximity that had once felt harmless and had later revealed its danger. They emphasized patience, not just of the investigation, but of the alleged act itself, suggesting a crime born not of impulse, but of opportunity carefully understood. The room was quiet as they spoke, the weight of decades settling into the present tense. The defense countered with restraint of their own, framing the case as an exercise in hindsight, a reconstruction vulnerable to distortion, arguing that time had transformed uncertainty into suspicion, coincidence into accusation. They reminded the jury that the defendant had lived freely for decades, uncharged, unconvicted, his life unfolding in plain view, and asked whether justice delayed could truly remain justice, or whether it risked becoming something else entirely. Doubt, they argued, grows in the gaps left by time. Witnesses took the stand one by one, their voices carrying fragments of a story that had once been lived, now remembered imperfectly. Some spoke with confidence, others hesitated, struggling to align their memories with the rigid structure of courtroom questioning. Dates blurred. Faces overlapped. Emotions surfaced unexpectedly, tears appearing where professionalism had been expected, because no amount of preparation can fully insulate a person from revisiting a moment that changed everything. The jury watched closely, tasked with weighing not just words, but credibility, intention, and the subtle signals that accompany both. Experts followed, their testimony dense, technical, anchored in charts and probabilities, explaining how evidence collected long ago could still speak with clarity today. They described methods that did not exist in 1995, tools that could extract meaning from what had once seemed silent. The defense challenged them aggressively, probing margins of error, questioning assumptions, highlighting the fragility of any conclusion drawn so long after the fact. It was a clash not of personalities, but of frameworks, certainty versus caution, progress versus skepticism. Throughout it all, the defendant sat largely still, his presence a study in restraint, eyes forward, expression controlled, the years having etched a kind of neutrality into his face that made it difficult to read what lay beneath. Observers searched for reactions, for moments of visible strain, but found little to hold on to. This too became part of the narrative, interpreted differently depending on who was watching, composure to some, detachment to others, a reminder that meaning is often projected as much as it is observed. As days turned into weeks, the trial settled into a rhythm, testimony stacking upon testimony, arguments layering over one another, the cumulative effect slowly shaping a picture that no single moment could define. Jurors took notes, their pens moving steadily, faces serious, aware that the decision they would eventually be asked to make carried consequences far beyond the courtroom. This was not just about guilt or innocence. It was about belief, about whether the past could be reconstructed with enough fidelity to justify punishment in the present. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited, commentators speculated, the story framed and reframed to fit the rhythms of modern media, sound bites replacing nuance, headlines compressing complexity into a handful of charged words. For the community, the spectacle was unsettling, the quiet horror of the original crime now amplified by a tension it had never sought. People avoided the area, or lingered too long, drawn by a need to witness history even as it reopened old wounds. Inside, closing arguments approached, and with them a shift in tone. The prosecution urged the jury to see the case not as a collection of isolated facts, but as a pattern, a convergence of evidence that, taken together, told a coherent story of responsibility. They spoke of patience rewarded, of a system that, though slow, had not abandoned its duty. The defense responded by urging restraint, warning against the temptation to resolve discomfort with certainty, reminding the jury that doubt is not a flaw in justice, but its foundation. When the jury was finally sent to deliberate, the courtroom exhaled, the tension redirecting itself into anxious waiting. Hours passed. Then days. Speculation filled the void, each update parsed for meaning, each delay interpreted as a sign, though no one truly knew what was happening behind closed doors. Deliberation is its own kind of silence, one that demands respect but invites projection, and both sides waited, knowing that control had passed out of their hands. The verdict, when it came, arrived without flourish, spoken plainly, its words carrying the accumulated weight of everything that had led up to them. Some reacted immediately, emotion breaking through composure, relief and grief colliding in unpredictable ways. Others sat stunned, processing what had just been said, the finality of it settling slowly, unevenly. There was no universal response, no shared release, only individual reckonings unfolding in parallel. Sentencing followed later, another chapter in a process that seemed endless even as it moved inexorably forward. The judge spoke of accountability, of the seriousness of the crime, of the years lost to both the victim and the community, acknowledging the unusual nature of the case without allowing that to overshadow its core. The words were measured, formal, but they carried an undercurrent of recognition, an understanding that this was not a typical ending, not a neat resolution. When it was over, when the courtroom emptied and the cameras packed up, what remained was a quiet that felt different from the silence that had defined the case for so long. This was not the silence of unanswered questions, but of answers that demanded to be lived with. For some, it brought a measure of peace. For others, it raised new doubts, new reflections, new what-ifs that would never be fully resolved. The street where it had all begun returned to its routines, as streets always do, but something fundamental had shifted. The story was no longer suspended in uncertainty. It had a shape now, a conclusion imposed by the system, whether embraced or contested. People spoke of it differently, with less speculation and more gravity, aware that the past had finally asserted itself in a way that could not be undone. And yet, even with a verdict rendered, the case did not simply disappear. It lingered in conversations, in late-night reflections, in the uneasy awareness that justice, when it arrives after so long, carries complexity alongside closure. The Florida sun continued its indifferent arc across the sky, illuminating a place forever marked by what had happened there, reminding everyone who lived beneath it that time can delay truth, but it does not erase it, and that some stories, once awakened, never fully fall silent again. The aftermath unfolded more quietly than anyone expected, not with celebration or collective relief, but with a strange, unsettled stillness, as if the community itself was unsure how to behave now that the question it had lived with for so long had finally been answered by a jury of strangers. The verdict did not close a door. It opened others, internal ones, forcing people to re-examine memories they had carried for decades and now had to hold against an official narrative that felt both clarifying and deeply unsettling. Justice had spoken, but understanding lagged behind. On the street where it began, the days resumed their familiar shape, garbage trucks rumbling through in the early morning, sprinklers clicking on at dusk, neighbors nodding politely as they passed, yet beneath that surface routine, a quiet recalibration was underway. Every interaction from the past was being replayed, scrutinized, reframed.
À Borowet-Toul. À brief conversation. À Wave across à driveway.
Moments once filed away as ordinary were now heavy with implication, their meaning altered not by new facts, but by new context. The realization settled in slowly and unevenly, the danger had not arrived from outside. It had been embedded, normalized, accepted. For those closest to the victim, the verdict brought a complicated blend of validation and sorrow. Years of waiting had not prepared them for the emotional dissonance of finally hearing responsibility assigned. The legal system had done what it could, but it could not give back what had been taken, nor could it restore the version of the future that had vanished in 1995. Closure, they discovered, was not a moment but a process, one that unfolded in waves, sometimes bringing calm, sometimes reopening pain they thought had dulled with time. The defendant, now officially convicted, receded from public view, his presence reduced to paperwork, scheduled appearances, and the distant reality of incarceration. Yet his absence was felt as strongly as his presence had once been, a reminder that familiarity can be as deceptive as anonymity. Conversations about him became cautious, restrained, as if speaking his name too freely might invite uncomfortable questions about how well anyone truly knows the people around them. Law enforcement faced its own reckoning. For investigators who had carried the case for years, the outcome was a rare affirmation of patience, of persistence in the face of doubt, of the belief that some truths endure long enough to be uncovered even after decades of silence. But there was no triumph, only reflection. They understood better than anyone how close the case had come to being lost forever, how easily one misstep, one missed opportunity, could have left it unresolved. The verdict validated the work, but it also underscored the fragility of justice when time stretches too far. Within the broader true crime landscape, the case took on a life of its own, dissected in documentaries, podcasts, articles that framed it as proof that cold cases can be solved, that patience and technology can succeed where urgency once failed. The story was told and retold, often stripped of nuance, compressed into arcs that emphasized shock and revelation over the slow, grinding reality of investigation. For those who had lived it, these retellings felt incomplete, missing the texture of years spent not knowing, the quiet dread that does not translate easily into entertainment. The house remained, its walls unchanged, its address now permanently linked to a narrative it never asked for. New occupants learned quickly that some places carry histories that refuse to fade, that even when nothing outwardly marks them, they remain charged with memory. Real estate listings did not mention it, but neighbors did, carefully, respectfully, aware that silence could be mistaken for erasure. The house had become a landmark of sorts, not for what it looked like, but for what it represented. As time passed, debates emerged about the nature of justice itself. Was it enough, arriving so late? Did accountability after decades truly serve its purpose, or did it merely acknowledge a failure to act sooner? Opinions diverged, shaped by personal experience, by faith in institutions, by the weight of loss versus the promise of resolution. There were no easy answers, only perspectives shaped by the understanding that time complicates everything it touches. The jury members returned to their lives carrying a decision that would follow them in ways they could not fully anticipate. Some spoke of the burden of weighing decades-old evidence, of the responsibility of deciding a man's fate based on fragments preserved and interpreted long after the fact. Others found reassurance in the process, in the rigor of deliberation, in the belief that collective judgment, imperfect as it is, remains society's best tool for confronting wrongdoing. Their anonymity shielded them from scrutiny, but not from memory. For the community, trust rebuilt slowly, cautiously, never fully returning to its former simplicity. People became more aware, more observant, less willing to dismiss unease as imagination. The case became a reference point, a lesson passed quietly from one generation to the next, a reminder that safety is not guaranteed by familiarity, and that vigilance does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it lives in questions left unasked for too long. The passage of time did not soften the story's impact. If anything, it sharpened it, turning it into a cautionary tale about proximity, patience, and the limits of perception. The Florida sun still bathed the street in light, still cast long shadows in the evening, but those shadows now carried meaning, reminders of how easily normalcy can conceal darkness, how routine can mask intent. In moments of reflection, those connected to the case found themselves returning to the beginning, to that half-open door, to the sense that something was wrong before anyone could articulate it. That moment, frozen in memory, became symbolic of the entire story, a threshold between ignorance and awareness, between safety assumed and safety questioned. Crossing it had changed everything. The case did not end with sentencing. Appeals were filed, as they always are, arguments refined, legal battles continuing in quieter arenas far removed from public attention. The system moved on, procedural and persistent, acknowledging that finality is rare in matters of law. Yet regardless of what followed, the central truth remained: the silence that had once protected the crime had been broken, and it could not be restored. Years from now, the story would still be told, perhaps differently, perhaps with details emphasized or forgotten, but always anchored by the same unsettling core. A crime hidden in plain sight. A community forced to look inward. A truth that waited patiently for the moment when science, memory, and persistence finally aligned. And as night settled over the street, the houses quiet, the air heavy with heat and history, the lingering lesson pressed in on anyone willing to listen: that some mysteries do not announce themselves as mysteries at all, that they live alongside us, familiar and unremarkable, until time and truth conspire to reveal what was there all along, waiting unseen for decades. Time moved forward again, but it did so differently now, no longer dragging the case behind it like a shadow, no longer pulling unanswered questions through every season, because something fundamental had changed. The story had crossed from uncertainty into record, from suspicion into judgment, and yet the resolution did not erase its presence. Instead, it altered the way people carried it, transforming a living mystery into a permanent scar, one that shaped conversations, instincts, and the unspoken rules of a place that had learned, too late, what familiarity could hide. In the months following the verdict, the community settled into a quieter phase of reckoning, less visible, less dramatic, but no less intense. People talked less openly about the case, not because it no longer mattered, but because it mattered too much, because every discussion seemed to circle back to the same uncomfortable realization: the danger had not been a sudden intrusion, but a constant, woven into daily life so seamlessly that it had gone unquestioned. That realization was harder to live with than fear of an unknown attacker. It demanded introspection rather than vigilance, doubt rather than defense. The victim's story began to surface in new ways, less focused on the crime itself and more on the life that had been interrupted. Friends and distant relatives shared memories publicly for the first time, moments of laughter, small habits, gestures that never made headlines but defined who she had been. These accounts shifted the narrative subtly, pulling it away from spectacle and back toward humanity, reminding those who listened that the case was not an abstract puzzle finally solved, but the violent erasure of a person whose absence had echoed for decades. For investigators no longer assigned to the case, the resolution brought a rare opportunity to reflect openly on the process, on the choices made and the constraints faced in an era before modern forensic tools. They spoke cautiously, aware of scrutiny, but also candidly about the limitations that had shaped the early investigation, the missed opportunities that were not failures of effort, but of timing. Their reflections carried an undercurrent of warning, a recognition that countless other cases remained unresolved not for lack of truth, but for lack of means. The legal aftermath continued quietly, appeals advancing through higher courts with language far removed from the emotional gravity of the original trial. Motions referenced statutes and precedents, arguments framed in abstraction, as if the case were no different from any other. For those who had lived it, this procedural distance felt surreal, a reminder that the justice system, by necessity, reduces stories to arguments, lives to files, pain to paragraphs. It was efficient. It was necessary. It was never personal. Public attention waned, as it always does, drawn toward newer stories, fresher shocks, crimes that felt more immediate, more urgent. The case slipped out of headlines, then out of daily conversation, becoming something referenced occasionally, in documentaries, in retrospectives, in discussions about cold cases finally solved. Each retelling simplified it further, compressing decades into hours, complexity into narrative arcs, leaving behind a version that was easier to consume but less faithful to the lived experience. For the street itself, the resolution marked a slow, cautious return to something resembling normalcy, though the word no longer meant what it once had. Children played outside again. Neighbors lingered in driveways. Yet beneath these gestures was a new awareness, a collective understanding that safety is not a static condition, but an agreement maintained through attention, through willingness to question, through refusal to dismiss unease as paranoia. The street had matured, hardened by experience, less innocent but more honest. The house, once again, faded into the background, its significance diminishing as the years passed, though never disappearing entirely. It stood as a quiet witness, unchanged in structure, altered only by the weight of memory attached to it. Those who lived there learned to coexist with its history, discovering that spaces do not demand belief in their past, only acknowledgement. The walls did not speak. They did not accuse. They simply remained. In private moments, individuals who had known the neighbor struggled with a lingering sense of betrayal, not just by him, but by their own perceptions. They questioned their instincts, replayed moments when something had felt slightly off and had been dismissed, moments when politeness had overridden curiosity, when routine had smothered doubt. These reflections were not confessions of guilt, but acknowledgments of human limitation, of how easily danger can masquerade as normalcy when it wears a familiar face. The case also altered how law enforcement approached other unsolved crimes, reinforcing the value of preservation, of patience, of resisting the urge to close files prematurely. Evidence storage protocols were cited. Re-examinations encouraged. The story became an internal lesson, a reminder that time, while corrosive, can also be revealing, that advances in science can transform yesterday's dead ends into tomorrow's breakthroughs. Hope, tempered by realism, became part of the institutional memory. As years accumulated beyond the verdict, the emotional charge softened but never vanished, settling into something more reflective, more subdued. Anniversaries passed with less public acknowledgement, though some still marked them privately, lighting candles, pausing in thought, honoring a life that had once been reduced to a case number. Memory persisted, quieter now, but no less insistent. Occasionally, someone new to the area would ask about the story, sensing its presence without knowing its shape, picking up on hints in conversation, in tone, in the way certain names were spoken carefully. Long-time residents would decide in that moment how much to share, weighing the value of truth against the desire to protect the fragile equilibrium that had returned. Some told everything. Others offered fragments. The story lived on, fragmented, personalized, shaped by the teller's relationship to it. The broader implication lingered, a lesson that extended beyond one street, one town, one state. It spoke to the limits of perception, to the danger of equating familiarity with safety, to the uncomfortable truth that some threats are not sudden or obvious, but patient, quiet, embedded. It challenged the comforting narrative that evil announces itself clearly, reminding anyone willing to listen that it often does not. In reflective interviews years later, one investigator summarized it simply, without drama or embellishment, saying that the hardest cases are not the ones with the most violence, but the ones with the least noise, the crimes that slip into routine, that hide behind politeness and predictability, that wait for the world to look away. The case, he said, was never really about the evidence. It was about attention. About noticing what others overlook. As the Florida sun continued its steady rhythm, rising and setting over a street forever changed by what had happened there, the final shape of the story settled into place. Not as a triumph. Not as a cautionary tale neatly concluded. But as a reminder, persistent and unresolved in its own way, that truth does not always arrive on time, that justice does not always feel complete, and that the past, once awakened, does not return easily to sleep. And even now, long after the headlines have faded and the courtrooms have emptied, the echo remains, carried in memory rather than mystery, a low, steady presence that asks the same quiet question it asked from the beginning. How well do we truly know the lives unfolding just beyond our own front doors? The story refused to settle into history the way other cases eventually do, because even after verdicts and sentences and appeals filed in sterile language, the emotional residue lingered, stretching forward into years that had never been meant to carry it. The case no longer lived in courtrooms or police files. It lived in people, in the way they watched, in the way they listened, in the way ordinary moments acquired an extra layer of meaning that could not be peeled away. Justice had been rendered, but the consequences of waiting for it had not expired. As seasons turned, the community learned that resolution does not erase memory, it reorganizes it. What had once been an open wound became scar tissue, firm, sensitive, easily reminded of its origin. Conversations shifted from speculation to reflection, from who did it to how it had gone unnoticed for so long. That question proved harder to answer than the one the trial had resolved, because it required honesty not just about one individual's actions, but about collective assumptions, about the comfort people take in routine, in predictability, in believing that danger always announces itself clearly. You could hear that change in tone when long-time residents spoke, a caution woven into their voices, an awareness that safety is something maintained rather than assumed. Parents spoke differently to their children, not with fear, but with emphasis, encouraging awareness without paranoia, teaching that trust and attentiveness are not opposites, but partners. The case had become a lesson passed down quietly, stripped of its sensational edges, refined into something more practical, more enduring. For those who had known the defendant personally, the passage of time brought no clean reconciliation. Some held tightly to anger, to betrayal that never fully softened, while others drifted toward a more uneasy acceptance, recognizing that understanding was not the same as forgiveness. They revisited memories with a new lens, searching for coherence, for a version of the past that made sense, even knowing that such clarity was impossible. The mind, after all, resists the idea that the familiar can also be catastrophic. In professional circles, the case continued to circulate as an example, cited in conferences, training sessions, discussions about cold case methodology and the ethics of delayed prosecution. It was referenced not for its drama, but for its persistence, for the way incremental progress eventually overtook decades of inertia. Detectives spoke of it as a reminder that evidence does not expire, that patience, while costly, can still pay dividends when paired with restraint and rigor. Yet they also acknowledged what had been lost in the waiting, witnesses unavailable, memories blurred, opportunities missed forever. The victim's name, once confined to reports and headlines, gained a quieter permanence. It appeared on memorials, in private dedications, in moments of pause rather than public display. Those who remembered her best understood that being known primarily through the lens of her death was a distortion, and they resisted it gently, persistently, sharing stories of her life that existed independently of the crime. In doing so, they reclaimed a measure of agency from a narrative that had long been dominated by violence. Every so often, new interest flickered, sparked by anniversaries or retrospective features, drawing attention back to the case with familiar language, solved cold case, shocking arrest, neighbor revealed. Each resurgence felt slightly off to those closest to it, as if the shorthand used to describe it could never fully capture the lived reality of waiting, of uncertainty stretched across years. They watched these retellings with a mix of detachment and discomfort, aware that the story now belonged to the public in ways it never had before. The legal process continued its slow march in the background, appeals resolved, motions denied, affirmations issued in language that carried finality without emotion. With each procedural milestone, the possibility of reversal receded, replaced by a growing sense of permanence. The system, imperfect and deliberate, had reached its conclusion. There would be no new chapter written by the courts. What remained would be written by memory. On the street, small rituals emerged, subtle acknowledgments that life had moved forward without forgetting. Some residents planted trees. Others maintained flowers near sidewalks, gestures that meant nothing to outsiders but carried private significance. These acts were not about mourning alone, but about continuity, about asserting that the space could hold both history and renewal without being defined entirely by either. The house itself continued to age, paint fading, roofs replaced, interiors remodeled by occupants who had never known its past firsthand. And yet, even as its physical form changed, its symbolic weight endured, not as a warning sign, but as a reminder of how easily significance can be hidden behind normalcy. It stood as evidence that places, like people, can carry layers invisible at first glance. As technology advanced further, new cold cases were reopened, new arrests made, new stories told, and each time, echoes of this case surfaced, comparisons drawn, patterns noted. The idea that a crime could wait decades to be answered no longer felt extraordinary. It felt expected. That shift, subtle but profound, reshaped public understanding of justice, extending its timeline, complicating its definition. For some, the case inspired renewed faith in perseverance, in the notion that truth can outlast concealment. For others, it reinforced skepticism, highlighting how close the story had come to being lost forever, how much depended on chance, on preservation, on the unpredictable convergence of science and will. Both interpretations coexisted, unresolved, reflecting the dual nature of the outcome itself. In quieter moments, those who had lived through the entire arc found themselves returning not to the end, but to the beginning, to the sense of wrongness that had hung in the air before anyone knew why, to the half-open door that had marked the boundary between normalcy and rupture. That image endured because it captured the essence of the case better than any verdict ever could, the moment when something familiar revealed itself as irrevocably altered. Years later, when asked what lingered most, one resident described it not as fear, but as awareness, a sharpened sense of attention to the ordinary, an understanding that safety is not the absence of threat, but the presence of care. That perspective, shaped by experience rather than theory, became the quiet legacy of the case, its most enduring impact. The Florida heat still pressed down on the neighborhood each summer, unchanged, indifferent, casting the same long shadows it always had. But the people beneath it were different now, carrying a history that had taught them to look twice, to listen longer, to question gently but persistently. The case had closed, officially, irrevocably, but its influence continued, subtle and pervasive, shaping how a community understood itself. And in that continued influence, the story found its final form, not as a mystery solved or a villain exposed, but as a reminder etched into collective memory, that time can delay reckoning, but it cannot erase consequence, and that the most unsettling truths are often the ones that arrive quietly, after years of waiting, asking us not what happened, but what we failed to see when it mattered most. By the time the case slipped fully out of the news cycle, replaced by newer crimes and louder tragedies, it had already done its deepest work, embedding itself into the psychology of everyone it had touched, reshaping how they understood time, trust, and the thin line between the ordinary and the catastrophic. The absence of headlines did not mean the absence of impact. It meant the story had transitioned into something quieter, more permanent, a background presence that surfaced in unexpected moments, unannounced and unavoidable. People discovered that memory does not fade evenly. Certain details sharpened with age while others dissolved, leaving behind impressions rather than facts, feelings rather than images. A glance held too long. A conversation cut short. A sound at night dismissed as nothing. These fragments resurfaced without warning, triggered by nothing more than a familiar streetlight or the sound of a door opening in the early morning. The mind, once freed from uncertainty, seemed determined to reconstruct the past in search of coherence, even knowing such coherence was an illusion. For the victims' loved ones, the years after the trial were defined not by grief alone, but by adjustment, by learning how to carry a truth that had taken so long to arrive. The verdict answered one question while exposing others: quieter but no less persistent. Who might she have been now? What paths would she have taken? How different would life have looked if that ordinary day in 1995 had ended the way it was supposed to? These questions had no legal resolution, no procedural endpoint. They lived on in private reflection, in moments of stillness that arrived without warning. The investigators who had shepherded the case through its final phase returned to their routines, other files, other crimes, but the case followed them in ways that were difficult to articulate. It became a reference point, an internal calibration, influencing how they assessed leads, how they evaluated silence, how they weighed patience against urgency. They spoke of it rarely, but when they did, it was with a respect that bordered on caution, as if acknowledging that the case had taught them something fundamental about the limits and possibilities of their work. In training rooms and quiet conversations, it was cited not as a triumph, but as a warning, a reminder that justice is vulnerable to time, that every unsolved case exists in a fragile balance between preservation and loss. Evidence, they emphasized, must be treated as a future conversation, not a relic of the past. Because science évolue. Witnesses change. And what seems insignificant today may one day become decisive. The defendant's name gradually lost its immediacy, spoken less often, stripped of the emotional charge it once carried. In official records, it remained fixed, attached permanently to a crime that defined the end of his story far more than the beginning. In the community, it became shorthand for something broader, less personal, a symbol of proximity betrayed, of assumptions overturned. People referred to him obliquely, rarely directly, as if naming him too clearly risked reviving discomfort they preferred to keep contained. The street itself continued to age, houses renovated, families replaced by others who had no personal memory of the events that once defined the area. Children grew up hearing fragments, half-stories passed down cautiously, sanitized of detail but heavy with implication. They learned that something had happened here, something important, something that changed how people thought. They did not need to know every detail to absorb the lesson. The atmosphère carried it forward. Occasionally, someone would ask why the case still mattered now that it had been resolved, and the answer, though rarely stated outright, lived in the collective response. It mattered because it revealed how easily certainty can be constructed from habit. Because it showed how danger can coexist with normalcy without announcing itself. Because it demonstrated that time, often assumed to be the enemy of justice, can also become its most unlikely ally. In academic circles, the case appeared in studies on delayed prosecution, memory reliability, forensic evolution. Scholars debated its implications, dissected its timeline, argued about thresholds of proof and the ethics of revisiting lives so long after the fact. These discussions were abstract, theoretical, necessary in their own way, but far removed from the lived reality of those who had waited decades for answers. The gap between analysis and experience remained vast, unbridgeable. As anniversaries came and went, marked quietly if at all, the case settled into a rhythm of remembrance that required no ceremony. Some paused privately on the date it happened. Others marked the date of the arrest instead, seeing it as the moment when time finally shifted direction. Both were valid. Both acknowledged that the story had more than one beginning, more than one ending. The house, once again, stood at the center of these reflections, not because it demanded attention, but because it absorbed it. People passed by without stopping, aware without staring, understanding that places do not choose their histories. The house had become a silent witness to the passage of time, its walls holding nothing but echoes imposed by memory, by narrative, by the human need to anchor meaning to physical space. As the years added distance, some began to speak of forgiveness, not in a moral or religious sense, but as a psychological necessity, a way to release the hold the case still exerted over their thoughts. Forgiveness, they learned, did not mean forgetting or excusing. It meant acknowledging the limits of control, accepting that some outcomes arrive too late to feel satisfying, yet still demand recognition. This, too, became part of the case's legacy. For newer residents, the story surfaced unexpectedly, often through casual conversation or offhand remarks that hinted at something deeper. When they asked, longtime neighbors gauged their curiosity carefully, deciding how much to reveal. Some told the full story, believing that truth, even uncomfortable, was worth preserving. Others offered fragments, allowing the past to remain present without overwhelming the present. In this way, the story adapted, changing shape without losing its core. The Florida landscape remained unchanged: bright skies, relentless sun, the hum of cicadas in summer evenings, a sensory constancy that contrasted sharply with the upheaval the case had caused. Nature, indifferent to human drama, provided a backdrop that made the story feel both distant and immediate, a reminder that life continues regardless of unresolved pain or delayed justice. In moments of introspection, people returned again and again to the same realization: the case was never just about a crime. It was about attention. About the cost of assuming safety. About the danger of equating familiarity with trust. These insights, hard-earned and uncomfortable, became the true inheritance of the story, shaping behavior in subtle ways that rarely made headlines. And so the case lived on, not as an active investigation, not as a courtroom drama, but as a quiet presence woven into the fabric of a place and its people. It influenced how they looked at one another, how they interpreted silence, how they understood the passage of time. The cold case had been solved, officially, conclusively, but its meaning continued to unfold, resisting final definition. In the end, that resistance may have been the most honest outcome of all, because some stories do not resolve into clarity so much as they teach us how to live with complexity. The truth had surfaced, late but undeniable, and in doing so, it left behind a question more enduring than any mystery, not whether justice can arrive after decades, but how we carry what it reveals once it finally does.